the single most important military aircraft ever shot down. There are thousands of aircraft that have fallen from the skies throughout history, each with its own story of courage, tragedy, and fate. Yet, among all those wrecks scattered across battlefields and oceans, one downing stands above the rest, not for the number of lives lost, but for how it changed the course of history. This is the story of the single most important military aircraft ever shot down. The date was May 27, 1941, and the world was deep in the chaos of World War II. The mighty German battleship Bismarck, pride of the Kriegsmarine, was tearing through the North Atlantic. It had already sunk HMS Hood, the Royal Navy's most famous battlecruiser, killing over 1,400 sailors. Britain was in shock. Winston Churchill gave a simple, furious order: sink the Bismarck. But there was a problem. Bismarck was fast, heavily armored, and vanishing into the Atlantic fog. The Royal Navy had no idea where she was headed, and every hour she stayed hidden meant she might reach safety in France beyond the reach of British bombers. The fate of the Atlantic War suddenly depended on finding one ship in an ocean. Then came one aircraft, a slow, fragile Fairey Swordfish biplane flying from the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. Built of wood and fabric, it looked laughably outdated, more like something from World War I than the cutting-edge fighters and bombers of 1941. But on that cold, windswept evening, that little plane and its crew of 3 would make history. Flying low over the waves, buffeted by wind and flak, the Swordfish closed in on the Bismarck. Anti-aircraft guns filled the air with metal and fire, but the slow speed of the biplane, ironically, made it harder to hit. The crew released a torpedo, which streaked through the water and struck the Bismarck's stern. At first, it seemed like just another hit, damage, but not fatal. Then the incredible happened. The torpedo jammed Bismarck's rudder. The ship could no longer steer. It began to circle helplessly in the Atlantic, turning itself into a sitting target. In that moment, the war at sea changed. Bismarck, the terror of the Atlantic, was crippled, unable to escape, unable to maneuver. The next morning, British battleships closed in and unleashed a storm of shells. Within hours, the pride of Nazi Germany was gone, sinking beneath the waves, taking over 2,000 sailors with her. And all because one ancient biplane had landed a single, lucky, perfectly timed strike. Some might argue other aircraft were more important. Perhaps the American U-2 spy plane shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960, which sparked an international crisis and nearly derailed Cold War diplomacy. Or the Japanese plane carrying Admiral Yamamoto in 1943, when U.S. cryptographers intercepted his flight plan and P-38 fighters ambushed him, killing the man who had masterminded Pearl Harbor. That event devastated Japanese morale. But the Swordfish strike on Bismarck stands apart for what it represented. It was the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic, a campaign that decided whether Britain would live or starve. If Bismarck had escaped, German surface raiders might have regained dominance over Allied shipping, strangling supplies from America. Britain might have faced even darker days before D-Day was even possible. That one torpedo, fired by a crew who probably expected to die, ensured that didn't happen. So what made this aircraft, this flimsy biplane, the most important ever shot down? Because, ironically, it did get shot down. Many Swordfish didn't survive their missions. They were slow, they were obsolete, and they were slaughtered in dozens of attacks throughout the war. But in this single case, that frail machine carried the weight of empires on its wings. It's a powerful reminder that technological superiority doesn't always decide history. Courage, timing, and sheer willpower often do. The Fairey Swordfish was outmatched by everything it faced, yet it delivered the strike that shifted naval power in the Atlantic. When the Bismarck sank, Britain's sailors cheered. Churchill, upon hearing the news, simply said, "The Bismarck is sunk." Behind that simple sentence lay the result of thousands of miles of pursuit, hundreds of lives, and the bravery of a handful of airmen flying a machine that should have been in a museum. The Swordfish that disabled the Bismarck didn't survive the war. It was later destroyed, like so many others, during training or routine operations. Yet its legacy is immortal. Its story lives on as a symbol of how even the humblest tools, when wielded by brave hands, can alter the destiny of nations. So when we ask, what is the single most important military aircraft ever shot down? The answer isn't the fastest jet or the most advanced bomber. It's the slow, fragile, almost forgotten biplane that crippled a battleship and changed the war at sea, the Fairey Swordfish, a wooden relic that reminded the world that courage can fly, even with canvas wings. When we think of turning points in war, our minds often go to great battles, brilliant generals, or monumental invasions. Yet sometimes, history turns not on the clash of armies, but on the aim of one crew, flying one fragile aircraft in one fleeting moment. The single strike delivered by a Fairey Swordfish biplane against the German battleship Bismarck in May 1941 was one such moment, a brief flash of courage and precision that forever altered the course of the war at sea. This wasn't a triumph of overwhelming power or of cutting-edge technology. It was the victory of determination, skill, and fate, all converging in the North Atlantic under a shroud of wind and rain. The story begins in the spring of 1941. Europe was burning. The German war machine had conquered most of the continent, and Britain stood alone against Hitler's seemingly unstoppable forces. The Atlantic Ocean had become Britain's lifeline, a vast, perilous highway through which food, oil, and weapons had to travel from America and the colonies. If that lifeline were severed, Britain would starve, and with it, all hope of liberating Europe would fade. The Germans knew this, and so the war at sea became a desperate struggle of survival. German U-boats hunted merchant ships by the dozens, and above them lurked an even greater menace, the surface raiders, the mighty warships of the Kriegsmarine. None inspired more fear than one name, Bismarck. The Bismarck was not just a battleship. She was a floating fortress, the embodiment of German engineering and naval ambition. Over 50,000 tons of steel, 8 massive 15-inch guns, thick armor, and an aura of invincibility. To the British public, already reeling from Blitz bombings and the fall of France, the appearance of Bismarck in the Atlantic was like a nightmare come to life. She was faster than most ships that could outgun her, and more powerful than most ships that could catch her. She was designed for one purpose: to break the British blockade, destroy convoys, and strangle Britain's supply lines until the island nation collapsed. On May 24, 1941, the Bismarck proved her power. In the icy waters of the Denmark Strait, she met HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, a ship that symbolized British naval might for 2 decades. The confrontation lasted mere minutes. A shell from Bismarck found its mark, and Hood exploded in a cataclysmic fireball, taking 1,415 men down to the cold sea. Only 3 survived. The news hit Britain like a thunderclap. The nation mourned, but the mood quickly hardened into fury. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's words echoed through the Admiralty: "Sink the Bismarck." It wasn't a request, it was an order that carried the weight of an empire. From that moment, the North Atlantic became a hunting ground. Every available British ship was thrown into the chase. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers scoured the vast gray expanse of ocean, desperately seeking a single enemy warship among thousands of square miles of water. But Bismarck was elusive. After the battle with Hood, she slipped into the fog, her crew determined to reach occupied France, where she would be safe under Luftwaffe protection. If she made it, she could return to strike again and again, not crippling the Atlantic convoys that kept Britain alive. Time was running out, and the Royal Navy knew it. The ocean is a merciless place to play hide and seek. Hours turned into days. The British ships burned precious fuel as they crisscrossed the Atlantic. The tension aboard was unbearable. Every sighting report, every flicker on the radar could mean salvation or disappointment. The stakes could not have been higher. Then, on May 26th, a stroke of fortune arrived. A Coastal Command aircraft spotted Bismarck. She was less than 700 miles from the French coast. The British fleet was scattered and far behind, but one weapon still had a chance: the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal and her squadron of Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers. If the word bomber conjures up images of sleek modern aircraft, the Swordfish was the exact opposite. Built of fabric and metal tubing, with an open cockpit and a top speed of barely 140 miles per hour, it was already obsolete before the war even began. Its pilots joked that it was so slow, enemy radar had trouble detecting it. To the outside world, the idea of these creaking biplanes attacking the most advanced warship in the world seemed suicidal. Yet these were the only aircraft available, and the men who flew them, young, determined, and fearless, didn't hesitate for a moment. The weather that evening was savage. The North Atlantic tossed and roared, waves rising like mountains and rain slashing across the deck. As the Swordfish crews prepared for takeoff, they knew what awaited them: a sky filled with flak, a sea filled with death. Still, one by one, the old biplanes struggled into the air, wings trembling in the gale. Among them was the aircraft flown by Lieutenant Commander John "Jock" Moffett. His target was the Bismarck, moving fast, zigzagging through the storm, its guns ready to blast any attacker from the sky. When the Swordfish approached, the Bismarck opened fire. The sky erupted in flames and steel. Tracers arced through the clouds, flak bursts bloomed around the fragile planes. It was a sight of terrible beauty. David against Goliath, fabric wings against fortress guns. The pilots dove low, so low their wheels nearly skimmed the waves, making themselves harder to hit. Moffat's plane was tossed by the wind, his vision blurred by spray and smoke, but he held steady. His observer shouted ranges and bearings. His gunner kept a nervous eye on the sea. Every second could be their last. Then came the moment. Moffat lined up his shot, dropped his torpedo, and pulled up hard. The weapon sliced into the water and sped toward the target. Seconds later, an impact. The torpedo slammed into Bismarck's stern. On board the German ship, a shudder ran through the steel giant. Damage reports came in quickly, flooding aft compartments, some electrical failures. At first, it didn't seem catastrophic. The crew had trained for damage control. They were calm, efficient. But then the engineers realized the true horror. The rudder was jammed. The Bismarck could no longer steer properly. She was locked into a slow, useless circle. That one torpedo, launched from a frail biplane in the middle of a storm, had sealed the battleship's fate. Now Bismarck was no longer the hunter. She was the hunted. Through the night, destroyers harassed her with torpedoes and gunfire. At dawn, the great guns of HMS Rodney and King George Futh arrived, and the sea thundered with their barrage. The Bismarck fought back bravely, her crew firing until their last shells were spent. But she was outmatched and immobile. After more than an hour of relentless pounding, the once proud battleship rolled and sank beneath the waves. Out of over 2,200 men, only 114 survived. The sea swallowed the rest. When the news reached London, the reaction was electric. The sinking of Bismarck wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a symbolic one. Britain, isolated and under siege, had struck back at one of Hitler's most powerful weapons. The morale boost was enormous. Churchill, upon hearing the report, allowed himself a rare smile. His simple message, "The Bismarck is sunk," carried relief, triumph, and a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, the tide could turn. That single torpedo hit had changed the strategic balance of the Atlantic. The Bismarck had been designed to terrorize convoys, to give Germany control over the shipping lanes. Her loss not only removed that threat, but also demonstrated that surface raiders, no matter how formidable, were vulnerable in the age of air power. From that point onward, the German Navy never again attempted to send a major battleship into the Atlantic in the same way. The Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, spent most of her career hiding in Norwegian fjords, hunted by Allied aircraft until she too was destroyed from the air. The lesson was clear. The era of the great battleship was ending, and the aircraft had taken its place as the true master of the seas. Yet, what makes this event so remarkable is how narrow the margin was between victory and disaster. If that torpedo had missed, if the rudder had not jammed, Bismarck might have reached France. She would have repaired, refueled, and returned to the Atlantic to continue her deadly work. Convoys would have suffered heavier losses, Britain's supplies would have dwindled, and the morale of the British people might have cracked. Instead, because of one strike from one obsolete aircraft, the tide of the naval war shifted in Britain's favor. It is hard to imagine a clearer example of how a single act of courage can change the destiny of nations. The men who flew those swordfish didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were professionals doing their duty. Many of them didn't live to see the end of the war. The Swordfish Squadron suffered heavy losses in later campaigns, their slow planes easy targets for enemy fighters. But their reputation was forever secured by that night over the Atlantic. Naval aviators across the world came to respect the courage it took to fly into a storm of gunfire in a plane slower than most cars. It became a defining symbol of British resilience, outdated technology perhaps, but wielded with unmatched determination. From a broader perspective, the attack on Bismarck marked the moment when the aircraft carrier replaced the battleship as the centerpiece of naval warfare. Before 1941, battleships had ruled the seas for nearly half a century. They were symbols of national pride, floating embodiments of power and prestige. But as Bismarck burned and sank, the Admiralty and the world saw that even the mightiest warship could be undone by a few small aircraft operating hundreds of miles away. The same lesson would soon be reinforced in the Pacific, where carriers and their aircraft decided the fate of entire fleets at Coral Sea and Midway. But it was the Swordfish and their fateful Torpedo that had shown the world the future first. The Bismarck affair also showcased the incredible coordination and determination of the Royal Navy. The hunt stretched over thousands of miles, involved dozens of ships, and required constant communication and courage in brutal conditions. It was one of the most complex naval operations of the war, and every sailor, every pilot, every signalman who played a part contributed to the final victory. But at its heart, it all came down to that single improbable torpedo hit. A moment of human precision amid chaos. To appreciate just how extraordinary that shot was, one must imagine the conditions. The aircraft bouncing violently in the wind, instruments unreliable, visibility near zero. The target moving and turning through stormy seas, its gunners firing thousands of shells into the sky. The pilot had mere seconds to aim, to judge speed and distance, and to release at just the right angle for the torpedo to hit the vulnerable stern. That he succeeded was as much a testament to instinct and training as to luck. Even German officers later admitted that the torpedo hit was 1 in a million, the kind of shot that decides wars. History is full of grand battles and sweeping strategies, but it is also built on these small, decisive moments. The Fairey Swordfish's attack on Bismarck wasn't grand in scale, but its impact rippled through the rest of the war. It ensured the Atlantic lifeline remained open. It preserved Britain's capacity to fight. It inspired confidence that no enemy, no matter how formidable, was beyond reach. In that sense, the Swordfish's strike was more than a victory of arms. It was a victory of spirit. As years passed, the world moved on. New wars came, new aircraft were built, and new generations of pilots took to the skies. Yet the story of the Swordfish and the Bismarck remained etched in the annals of naval history. Museums display the remains of those biplanes today, their fabric and wood carefully preserved, their slow engines silent reminders of an age when bravery mattered more than speed. Veterans who survived the attack would later speak not of glory, but of the sheer terror and determination of that night. The freezing air, the roar of the guns, the knowledge that they might never return. They spoke of the strange stillness after the torpedo dropped, when all they could do was hope it would hit. For those who study history, it stands as a lesson in the unpredictable nature of warfare. No plan, no machine, no empire is invincible. Sometimes fate hinges on one torpedo, one pilot, one decision made in the chaos of battle. The Swordfish strike reminds us that even the smallest forces can bring down giants. It is the essence of what makes history so human. The idea that courage, timing, and chance can combine to change the world. That is why, when we speak of the most important aircraft ever shot down, or the most significant in history, we remember the Fairey Swordfish. Because its success didn't come from design superiority or numbers, but from the sheer willpower of its crew. It wasn't a weapon of dominance, but a tool of desperation, used by men who refused to give up. And through that refusal, through that single perfect strike, they helped secure the future of the free world. War has always been a contest of machines, of who can build faster, strike harder, and endure longer. But beneath every gleaming aircraft and every thundering tank lies something no blueprint can measure: the human spirit. The Fairey Swordfish, an outdated biplane that flew into history against the mighty Bismarck, stands as the purest proof that courage, not technology, decides the fate of battles. It was slow, fragile, and by every logical measure, obsolete. Yet when the world's future balanced on the edge of survival, it was this fragile relic and the men inside it who dared to do the impossible. The story of their flight is not merely about war, it's about belief, duty, and the enduring truth that machines don't win wars. People do. By 1941, aviation had evolved into the age of power and speed. The world's skies were filled with metal, Spitfires and Messerschmitts, Heinkels and Hurricanes, sleek, roaring symbols of industrial might. In contrast, the Fairey Swordfish looked like a relic from another era. Its fabric-covered wings, open cockpit, and radial engine belonged more to the Great War than to the brutal, mechanized struggle raging across Europe. It could barely reach 140 miles per hour in perfect weather, and its defensive armament was laughably small, a single machine gun. Pilots who trained on it often joked that it was slower than the seagulls that followed their carriers. But jokes turned to silence when they took off into the dark, cold air of the North Atlantic, knowing that speed wouldn't save them from anti-aircraft fire. The Swordfish's mission against the Bismarck in May 1941 was not just a desperate gamble, it was an act of faith. Faith in their shipmates who had died aboard HMS Hood, faith in the Royal Navy's call to duty, and faith in themselves, that somehow, in a storm of iron and fire, they could make a difference. The pilots who flew those biplanes weren't equipped with radar or modern targeting systems. They relied on instinct, training, and teamwork. The unspoken trust between pilot, observer, and gunner that bound them closer than family. Theirs was a bond forged not in comfort, but in shared peril. Every flight over the ocean was a brush with death. Every mission a test of nerves and endurance. When HMS Ark Royal received the order to launch its Swordfish squadrons, the weather was appalling. Winds howled, rain lashed across the deck, and waves crashed over the bow of the carrier. The steel runway heaved and tilted beneath the planes, threatening to fling them into the sea before they even took off. The crews could have waited for calmer weather, but time was a luxury they didn't have. The Bismarck was steaming toward France, just a day away from safety. Once within range of the Luftwaffe, she would be untouchable. Every minute counted. So despite the wind, despite the danger, the pilots climbed into their cockpits, their leather gloves stiff from the cold, their breath fogging in the night air. Engines roared, wings trembled, and one by one, the Swordfish were flung into the storm. Imagine for a moment what that felt like. The ocean below, black, endless, and unforgiving. The sky above, filled with rain and lightning. Your aircraft, open to the elements, vibrating with every gust of wind, the fabric skin rippling like a living thing. You know the target ahead of you is a battleship, bristling with guns, each one capable of tearing your fragile plane to shreds. You know that even if you hit your mark, the odds of surviving the return trip are slim. And yet, you fly on. Not because you expect glory, not because you seek medals, but because your comrades at sea depend on you. That is courage, the quiet, steady kind that doesn't shout or boast, but simply refuses to yield. As the Swordfish approached the Bismarck, the sea erupted in chaos. Anti-aircraft guns spat fire into the clouds, and tracer rounds stitched the sky with deadly light. The Bismarck's gunners were professionals. They had trained to destroy fast, modern aircraft, not slow-moving biplanes that seemed to float rather than fly. Ironically, that very slowness worked in the Swordfish's favor. The ship's targeting computers couldn't lock onto such low speeds. The shells exploded ahead or behind, missing by precious meters. But this was no comfort to the men in the air. They could see the explosions all around them, hear the thump of shockwaves against the thin fuselage, smell the acrid tang of cordite. Every second in that storm of flak was an eternity. In one of the attacking planes, Lieutenant Commander John Moffett and his crew focused on their run. They could see Bismarck below, a gray titan cutting through the waves, its guns blazing, the sea around it alive with fury. Moffat dove low, almost skimming the surface, his hands gripping the controls with frozen determination. His observer called out bearings, his gunner fired bursts to distract the Germans. When the time came, Moffat leveled out, aimed his torpedo, and released it. He would later recall that moment as oddly peaceful. The sudden stillness after the drop, the sound of the engine, the feeling of emptiness as the weapon slipped away into the dark water. Then he pulled up, banking hard to escape the storm of fire. Seconds later, his torpedo struck the Bismarck's stern. A dull, deep explosion rolled across the ocean. On board the German ship, engineers scrambled to assess the damage. Within minutes, they discovered the truth. The rudder was jammed. The most powerful warship in the world could no longer steer. It was a wound from which it could not recover. That single torpedo dropped by a plane slower than a car had changed the entire battle. It was the triumph of courage over technology, of heart over hardware. But courage is not just found in those who make the perfect shot. It's also found in those who don't come back. Many swordfish were lost in the war, their crews swallowed by the sea, their stories forgotten in the vast ledger of conflict. Yet their spirit lived on in every man who took off knowing he might never land again. To fly an aircraft that was outdated before the war began, to face enemy fighters that could outrun and outgun you in every way, took a kind of bravery that few can imagine. They knew the odds, and they went anyway. The Swordfish's success wasn't luck alone. It was the product of relentless training and discipline, the mastery of a machine's limitations. The pilots learned how to use the aircraft's slow speed to their advantage, how to skim waves to avoid radar, how to drop torpedoes at just the right angle and distance. They turned weakness into strength, clumsiness into cunning. That adaptability, that willingness to use what they had rather than lament what they lacked, was what set them apart. They embodied the fighting spirit of wartime Britain, a nation battered but unbroken, short on resources but rich in resolve. It's easy, in hindsight, to see their mission as heroic, but heroism rarely feels that way in the moment. For those men, the world had narrowed to the sound of the engine, the flicker of instruments, and the constant awareness of death nearby. They weren't thinking of history or destiny, only of the next wave, the next adjustment, the next second of survival. Courage, in its truest form, isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet endurance. It's the decision to keep flying when every instinct tells you to turn back. It's trust in your machine, your crew, and yourself. The Swordfish pilots were ordinary men drawn into extraordinary circumstances. They came from small towns and cities, from farms and factories. Many had joined the Royal Navy before the war. Others volunteered after seeing their country under threat. They trained hard, often in primitive conditions, learning to navigate by the stars, to read the sea, to make split-second decisions. When they flew, they carried not just bombs and torpedoes, but the weight of a nation's hope. Every mission was a reminder that technology might shape the battlefield, but courage shapes the outcome. Even the German officers who fought against them were astonished by their bravery. Survivors from the Bismarck later described the attack as relentless and unnerving. They couldn't believe that the British would send such fragile planes against their ship, and even less that those planes would press home their attack through the wall of gunfire. They came to respect the Swordfish crews, acknowledging that no machine could account for such determination. In a war often defined by machines, this mutual recognition of courage was a rare moment of shared humanity. The legacy of the Swordfish goes beyond its technical achievements. It represents the enduring truth that technology alone doesn't guarantee victory. Throughout history, we see examples of advanced forces defeated by those with greater willpower, adaptability, and courage. The Greek phalanx fell to the Roman legion not because of better weapons, but because of better discipline. Napoleon's Grand Armée collapsed in Russia not for lack of skill, but for lack of endurance. And in the Atlantic, the Bismarck, a marvel of modern engineering, fell to a plane that looked like it belonged in a museum. Every one of these moments underscores the same lesson. Machines can fail, but the human spirit endures. In the months and years that followed, the Swordfish continued to serve with distinction. It hunted submarines, laid mines, and supported convoys. Its slow speed, once a liability, made it perfect for low-altitude patrols. It could take off and land from tiny escort carriers that larger planes couldn't use. Again and again, it proved that courage and ingenuity could turn even an obsolete machine into a weapon of victory. When German sailors saw the distinctive silhouette of a Swordfish overhead, they knew they were being watched by men who feared nothing, not even death itself. The story of the Swordfish also challenges our modern obsession with technology. We live in a world that often believes progress is everything. Faster, smarter, newer must mean better. Yet history reminds us that courage, resourcefulness, and human connection are timeless advantages. In 1941, all the technology in the world couldn't save the Bismarck. It couldn't outthink or outfeel the men in those canvas wings. The same principle applies even now. The finest machines mean nothing without the will to use them, the discipline to master them, and the bravery to risk everything for something greater than oneself. When the war finally ended, many swordfish were scrapped or left to rot in hangars. The world had moved on to jets and radar, to missiles and nuclear submarines. But for those who remember the dark days of 1941, the image of the swordfish flying low over stormy seas remained a symbol of defiance. It captured something eternal, the moment when humanity's courage outshone the brilliance of its machines. Generations later, when historians look back at that night over the Atlantic, they don't see a technical triumph. They see a moral one. The swordfish was never meant to win that fight, but it did. Not because it was the best aircraft, but because it was flown by the best men. That victory reminds us that courage is not measured in horsepower or firepower. It's measured in heartbeats, in the moments when fear is present, but action follows anyway. Even now, the story resonates. In museums across the world, visitors stare at the preserved swordfish, its wings patched, its frame aged by time, and wonder how such a fragile craft could have brought down the Bismarck. The answer lies not in its design, but in the people who flew it. Theirs was a courage that defied reason, that ignored the odds,